Hello everyone, my name is Anna. I welcome you all back to another English video where we are going to be continuing with our studies of the Brit Hadasha. In today's video, we are going to be analyzing chapter 15 on Mark, and the title for today's study is Wounded and Humiliated to Give Us Redemption. In this chapter, we're going to be seeing that the main focus is on the surrender of Yeshua. We are going to be seeing this from the moment that he is taken to Pilate to be judged and therefore be sentenced to death till the moment that he is hung on the timber and then he is buried in a tomb. In all of these events that we are going to be reading within these verses, we will see the fulfillment of all the prophecies that had been said towards Yeshua and the way that he was going to be killed. And all of these prophecies had been given in the Psalms and in the prophets. And we're going to be able to understand throughout our study that all of this had to happen because the Messiah would bring with him a great redemption to humanity. That final opportunity for the human being to be able to return to their creator through the Messiah and no longer have the need to give physical offerings, sacrifices, or even have the necessity to go to a physical place or have that communication with the Father through a person. Just as it was the case of the people of Israel, or even as we can read that it was the case in the time of Yeshua, where people still needed to go to the temple of Jerusalem to offer those sacrifices, those offerings, so that they can have that communication with the Father. And the moment that Yeshua gives himself as that perfect sacrifice that brings redemption to all humanity, that brings redemption to all humanity, now we don't have that necessity to have a physical temple or to even have a priest. Rather, our mediator is Yeshua, the Messiah, who now we can return to the Father and communicate to the Father through him. With this brief introduction, let's begin reading verses 1 to 5 of chapter 15 that say, "And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests consulted with the elders, scribes, and the whole council. And they bound Yeshua and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' He answered, 'You have said so.'" Verse 3, "And the chief priests accused him of many things. Pilate once again asked him, 'Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you.' But Yeshua made no further answer, so Pilate was amazed." In these verses, we can read that after Yeshua had been detained by the religious people, the religious people took Yeshua to Pilate so that he can judge him. And this was because at that time Rome had power over the Israelites, so therefore certain people were chosen by Rome so that they can govern the country that had been divided into 4 parts. And among those people who governed, there was Pilate. For this reason, it is why the religious leaders, not having any political power like the governors of that time, and therefore they did not have the saying to sentence Yeshua to death. It is why they take Yeshua before Pilate, so that Pilate, with the authority or the power that he had, which was greater than the religious people, he was going to be able to sentence him to death. Reading these verses, we can notice that the religious people were well aware that they couldn't accuse Yeshua for religious reasons, since this was not a political issue that affected or even interested Pilate as a governor. And for that reason, it is why we can read that the religious people decided to blame Yeshua for betrayal, saying that Yeshua had proclaimed himself to be the king of the Jews. Now, it is important to clarify that the title King of the Jews is not something that Yeshua gave himself or Yeshua proclaimed. Rather, as we have been reading throughout these two good news, or these two gospels of Mark and Matthew, we can understand, and we understand and we can come to the conclusion that the Creator who sent him and who gave him power and authority over Israel, and an earthly, not an earthly power, he was, or the Creator was the one that gave him that title. And with this we can make it well known, or we can with this we can say that Yeshua never proclaimed himself that title. Rather, the Eternal gave him that title. And the kingdom that the Messiah had brought was not a physical kingdom, but it was a spiritual kingdom. So understanding that the Creator was the one that gave Yeshua this title, it makes it easier to understand why Yeshua, being the King of the Jews, had to die. He had to give himself as a perfect offering that would cover the sins of every soul that voluntarily and sincerely did teshuvah, also known as repentance. And all of these souls, being renewed by the Messiah, would now have the opportunity to be part of the people of Israel, clarifying that this was not referring to a physical lineage, but rather a spiritual one. In John 18, verses 36 and 37, it perfectly explains what I'm mentioning in this portion of verses, where the Messiah says, Yeshua said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Yeshua answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." So right here, what it is narrated in John, it explains a little bit better what was occurring during this event where Yeshua was with Pilate. Now, another thing that we must clarify here is that the reason why the religious leaders decided to accuse the Messiah of claiming, quote unquote, claiming this title to himself is because in that time, if someone claimed to be king, or even to be king of the Jews, the people would usually interpret it as a rebellion or even possible political uprising against the Roman authority, which is why it was understood, or it was taken as a betrayal. And in this case, Pilate understood that Yeshua was, quote unquote, betraying the Roman authority. But if we analyze the words that Yeshua has been saying throughout his teachings, his parables, and if we analyze Yeshua's words, we can understand that this accusation that Yeshua was claiming that title to himself was false. It was not something that Yeshua had said or even done. And the lesson that we can learn from these verses is focused mainly on the attitude of the Messiah, because we can see that despite the accusations that were being made against him, which were obviously not true, we can see that Yeshua still remained silent. He remained calm. He did not try to defend himself or to liberate or free himself from being sentenced to death. Rather, he simply sought to fulfill the will of the Eternal. He understood what was happening. He understood that he had to suffer and that it was necessary for him to give himself as that perfect sacrifice, and therefore he trusted in the Eternal. And it is important that we learn, but not only learn, but also apply this attitude of the Messiah, especially as believers, which we know we are human beings, that we know that we go through difficult situations, moments where different situations where they can be seen as injustice, or where we can be accused of things that are false, where we can be accused of things that we've said or that we've done when truly that's not what happened, because there are a lot of misunderstandings. And Yeshua teaches us, taking his example, he teaches us that during those difficult moments that we go through, we must not lose our composure, we must not lose our trust or even our faith, but rather we must trust in the Father. And if we know that we have not done anything wrong, then there isn't any reason to fear the people and what they can do. We can read here that Yeshua was being accused of claiming himself as the King of the Jews when that was not even true, and he was going to receive death because of a false claim that had been given by the religious leaders. Yet he did not try to defend himself. He did not try to free himself from death. Rather, he just stayed silent, he stayed calm, and he put all of his trust in the Father. In Matthew 10, verse 28, it says, or it teaches us, or it's something that we must always keep in mind, that we must always keep in mind when we go through difficult situations, or when we go through difficult situations. It says, "Do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, be afraid of the one who can destroy both the soul and the body in hell." And it is important for us to be meditating in what it says in this verse of Matthew, because it's something that we must be it's something that we must do to make sure that that our life, or our actions, our fruits are well seen before the Creator, and that we are not despised by the Creator. From verses 6 to 15, we can read about this person named Barabbas. And it is said in these verses that this person was a dangerous prisoner who was known for stealing and killing in this place. And it is said that Pilate let the crowd choose who was going to be released, or who was going to receive freedom, whether it was Barabbas or Yeshua. And we can read that the crowd chose to release Barabbas and put Yeshua to death on a stake. The reason why Pilate allowed the people, or the multitude, to decide who was going to be granted the freedom was because the scripture mentions that this was a custom, but it was not a traditional or a tradition instituted by the Roman authority. It was actually a tradition or a custom that was instituted by the people, where they would take this moment to claim forgiveness towards a prisoner that won the election, I guess we can say, that won the election. And this tradition would take place during the Passover. So for this reason, it is why in these verses it narrates that Pilate took Yeshua and Barabbas in front of the multitude, and he let the multitude choose who was going to be freed and who was going to be sentenced to death. And in this event that we can read in these verses, it teaches us a lesson. It teaches us a lesson about the fallen condition of humanity. And this is because we can see that the people decided to give life to a person who not only broke the rules or the laws of the nation, but also broke the laws of the eternal that are found in the Torah. This person represented a great danger to the multitude. However, them being carried away by their carnality, by their emotions, decided to kill who decided to kill Yeshua, who was the Messiah that they were waiting for, that liberator that they were in need of, but they were not able to see him. They were not able to accept him because of their hardness of hearts. And for that reason, it is why they decided to kill him. And this was also because them being blinded, them having their hearts hardened, the moment that Yeshua was telling the truth by contradicting the teachings and laws that the religious leaders had put in the multitude, this caused the multitude to choose a prisoner, to choose a person that represented danger, that broke the laws of the nation and the laws of the eternal. They decided to give him freedom and give death to the human being. To give death to the Messiah. And reading this attitude that the multitude had in this moment, it teaches us the importance that we must not let ourselves be carried away by our emotions or by our carnality. It is important for us to not let ourselves be blinded, not only by the teachings of certain religions, but also in general what the world teaches, what the world believes. Because if we do get blinded by them, our hearts get hardened, and therefore we start living a life that is not pleasing towards the Father, and we can get to a point where we start taking decisions that will bring that would bring destruction to our soul, just as we can read that was the case of this multitude, that having the Messiah that they were waiting for, having that liberator that they were in need of, they didn't see him, they didn't accept him, and they put him to death. So this is a teaching that we can receive from these verses. From verses 16 to 21, we can read about another injustice that was done towards Yeshua, and in this case, it was by the Roman soldiers who, as we read in these verses, dressed Yeshua in purple garments and crowned him with thorns. We can read that they did this with cruel mockery, and the purpose of this was so that they can humiliate and scorn Yeshua in front of the whole crowd. It is important for us to understand that these events that we are reading throughout this chapter are not just for us to read and that's it. Rather, it is for us to understand how necessary it was for Yeshua to go through all of these injustice, so that in this way he could give to every soul the great redemption that would recognize so that in that way he could give great redemption to every soul that recognized and accepted the Messiah and his perfect service. The attitude that we see in these verses, we can see the attitude that Yeshua takes, and it is something that a true believer not only should admire, but also apply to his life. Because we can read that Yeshua, when going through all of these injustice, when going through all of these physical sufferings, through this humiliation, through this pain, everything that he was going through, I mean, we have to understand that he was living in a human body. He did feel the physical pain, and yes, he did go through humiliation, and he did obviously feel it. But despite him going through all of this bad treatment, through all of this injustice in front of all of these people, he does not give up in fulfilling with his perfect sacrifice. He does not hesitate because he understands his purpose in this world. And he not only understands it, but he also does everything so that he can fulfill his purpose. And with this, we can also see that he trusts in the Father at all times. He does not care, once again, what the man does to him or what the man says about him or anything, because he knows that he is right before the Father, that he is fulfilling his will, and that is all that matters for him. This security and this confidence that we can see in the Messiah should be the same thing in our lives. We must, obviously, we are not going to go through all the sufferings, like the physical sufferings and the physical humiliations that Yeshua went through that are narrated in these verses. But we do understand that we are going to go through difficult situations. We are going to go through moments where we think, or when we feel that we cannot overcome. But although we do get to feel that, we must try our best to always trust in the Father, to always have that security and to have that confidence in the Father, and to understand what our calling is, to fulfill our calling, which is to edify the body of the Messiah, to be those true and faithful servants towards the Father, living for the service of the Father. And this is a great and valuable teaching that we can receive from analyzing this attitude that Yeshua shows within these verses. Continuing with verses 22 to 32, it says, "And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them to decide what each one should take. And it was the 3rd hour when they crucified him." Verse 26, "And the inscription of the charge against him read, 'The King of the Jews.' With him they crucified 2 robbers, one on his right and one on his left." Verse 29, "Those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads, saying, 'You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross.'" Verse 31, "So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, 'He saved others, yet he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross, that we may see and believe.' Those who were crucified with him also reviled him." In these verses, we can read about the crucifixion, a term that has been associated with a specific form of a cross, and that also has been imposed to a certain extent by religion. However, the Greek, Latin, and Hebrew words that correspond to this word apply to various forms of executions that were done in that time and which ultimately were painful for that person. These executions were done by whether it was staking, nailing, or even tying the person that was being executed to a log, a timber, or a tree. With this, or mentioning all of this, it is easy to understand that Yeshua was not nailed on a cross, that just as the religions teach, and also how the Bible describes it in all of their translations, how we read in these verses that it says that he was nailed on a cross. So that he was nailed on a cross, which that was not true, because as I read in the Greek, Latin, and Hebrew words, which in that time were the main languages, that the interpretation, or the correct interpretation, would be staked, nailed, or tied to, in this case, a log, a timber, or a tree, and not a cross. So this is what we can understand, or what we must clarify reading these verses, because how I said, the cross or the crucifixion, it is something that has been imposed by a religion, and we can read these 2 words in all of the Bible translations. And this is a very important topic that every single one of us should analyze, not only with the scriptures, but also seeing the history of that time, how certain executions would be would be done. And in this case, I am only giving a brief summary of what I have understood about this topic. It is important that we all understand that every single one of us should investigate about this topic and therefore come to our own conclusions and not rely on what a person is saying regarding to this topic. So I invite you all, if it is your interest, to investigate more about this topic, about the crucifixion, if that's the real translation or if it's not, and therefore every single one of you guys would come to your own conclusions. But for now, this is all I can share to you guys about what I've understood regarding to this topic of the crucifixion. From verses 33 to 41, we can read about the death of the Messiah. And in these verses, we can see 4 important points that we must mention, that we must mention. The first point that we can see in these verses is regarding to the hours that are mentioned It is reported that Yeshua's execution began at the 3rd hour, then the 6th hour, and lastly, the last 3 hours, he died. 3 hours later, he died at the 9th hour. The hours within the scriptures are counted from evening to evening, usually or generally they're from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., which makes the 3rd hour correspond to 9 a.m., the 6th hour respond to 12 p.m., and the 9th hour correspond to 3 p.m. So in this case, we can read that Yeshua, his execution began in the 3rd hour, which is considered that happened at the 9th at the 9th at 9 in the morning, and his execution finished. In other words, Yeshua died in the 9th hour, which corresponds to 3 p.m. in the afternoon. So we can see, or understanding how the hours in the scriptures work, we can learn that Yeshua died at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. The second point that we can see within these verses is about the cry or the exclamation that Yeshua made at the 9th hour, which is at 3 p.m. We read that Yeshua cried out, "Elohai, Elohai, lema sabachthani," shortly before his death. This relates to the prophecy given in Psalms 22, verse 21, where it says, my Elohim, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? In this Gospel of Mark, which is considered one of the oldest of the Gospels, the phrase Elohai, Elohai was written in Aramaic. And in the Gospel of Matthew, which uses the phrase Eli, Eli, was written in Hebrew. So taking the phrase written in Hebrew, the Hebrew translation, it becomes easy to understand why, in this case, it relates, or in all of the 4 Gospels, it relates that the Jews hearing this exclamation or this cry of Yeshua, they interpreted as if Yeshua was calling the prophet Elijah. And this reaction, we can read it in verse 35. But in this case, understanding the translation that was given in this Gospel of Mark and the translation that was given in Matthew, using the translation of Mark, which is in Aramaic, we can, which says Elohai, Elohai, it makes it easy to understand, and also comparing it to what we read, or to the prophecy that is said in Psalms 22 verse 1, which says, my Elohim, it makes it easy to understand that that Yeshua was not calling out to the prophet to the prophet Elijah, rather he was calling out to his father. And this is something that it is also very important to clarify, that it was not how the Jews of that time took it as or interpreted as. The third point that we find in these verses is regarding to the events that occurred in the time of Yeshua's death. All of these events confirm that Yeshua is the Messiah, the Son of the Father, who was anointed and sent by the Eternal himself. These verses relate that immediately after Yeshua's death, out of nowhere, a great earthquake occurred, and because of this great earthquake, many bodies of saints rose from the dead. And this was something that had been announced in the Torah, and that even Yeshua himself said within these good news. And well, here we can see this fulfillment of Yeshua's words and the words that are found, or the prophecy that had been given in the Torah. We can also read that the sky turned dark, and obviously this was something that was not very common to happen, because this event occurred in the springtime, because once again, let's remember that all of this was happening in the time of Pesach, or as the Passover. And Pesach is always, or it takes place in the spring season. So in this case, understanding this, or understanding the moments that this event was happening, it makes it easier to understand that the reason why the people, seeing that the sky turns dark in a time where the sun is at its peak point, because let's also remember that Yeshua's death took place in the noon, where the sun is at its brightest point. It obviously did cause shock in the multitude. The fourth point that we see in these verses, it is about the veil of the sanctuary that was torn into pieces from top to bottom. If we remembered what we had studied in Exodus 26 verses 31 to 33, where we read about the instructions regarding the construction of the tabernacle, where later on it became the Temple of Jerusalem. And these verses of Exodus, we read that it was a mandate that there were two veils or curtains inside this temple, or inside this sanctuary. And one of these veils was placed in front of the altar of incense, where the priests accessed it every day. And the other veil separated the area that had been reserved for the highest priest, which obviously this place that was reserved was a holy place. And this place could only be accessed by the highest priest once a year on the Day of Atonement. So, remembering what we studied in Exodus and comparing it with what we read in this Gospel of Mark, it becomes easier to understand what the verse 38 is referring to when it says that the veil that was in the temple had been torn the moment that Yeshua died. And this was not only referring to the physical, it was not only referring physically, but also like spiritually, because let's remember that in that time the Temple of Jerusalem was still standing, and there were also priests that still had this role, that still had this role. And in this case, Yeshua, when he died, he torn down this veil spiritually because because he became that path, or that, yeah, he became that path, that mediator between the human being and the eternal, where now the human being has the opportunity to return to the Father through Yeshua, and not have to do it not have to do it through in a physical place or through a person. And so this is the veil that Yeshua took down physically and spiritually. And this is something that also is confirmed by the Apostle Paul in the book of Hebrews chapter 10 verses 19 to 22, where he says, "Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Yeshua, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain that is his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of Elohim, let us draw near to Elohim with a sincere and with the full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water." To conclude with today's chapter, from verses 42 to 47, it says, "And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, the day before the Shabbat, Joseph of Arimathea, as a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of Elohim, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Yeshua." Verse 44. Pilate was surprised to hear that he had already died, and summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. And Joseph brought a linen veil, and taking him down, wrapped his body in the linen veil, and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Verse 47, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where Yeshua was laid. In these last verses, we can read about the burial of the Messiah. The verses narrate that it was a day of preparation for Shabbat, although this was not referring to the Shabbat, or the weekly Shabbat, which is on Saturday, from Friday evening to Saturday evening, but it was actually regarding to the Shabbat of the holy appointments, since once again all of this was happening during the festivity of Pesach, or Pesach had already passed, where Yeshua had died. And according to the context of these verses, this burial or in this day, it was the beginning of the 15th day, which is a day of rest, because it is the first day of the festivity of Matzot, also known as the 7 days of unleavened bread. And this, we can confirm it with what we read in Exodus 12, verses 16 to 18, where it says, "On the first day hold a sacred assembly, and another one on the 7th day. Do not work at all on these days except to prepare food for everyone to eat. This is all you may do." Verse 17, "Celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come." Verse 18, "In the first month you are to eat bread made without yeast, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day." Another thing that we can read in these verses is that Joseph acted according to the commandment, because we can read that he asked Pilate for the body of Yeshua so that he can give Yeshua a decent burial. And reading everything that Joseph did so that he can give Yeshua this decent burial, it can be considered as something worthy that he did, as something very valuable, because reading all the details that Joseph put into this, into the place, the tomb where he put Yeshua, and how he got the corpse of Yeshua and put it in a veil, wrapped it in a veil, it was something that only the upper class of that time received that type of burial. And understanding this, we can see how this action that Joseph did was something very worthy, was something valuable. It represented that Joseph recognized Yeshua as a Messiah. And seeing this attitude of this character, Joseph, despite him being a respected member of the council, we can read that he was searching for the kingdom of Elohim, which the Messiah had mentioned. And for this reason, it is why Joseph recognized the Messiah and made his effort to give him this decent burial that he deserved. In these verses, we can see the fulfilled prophecy regarding the death of the Messiah so that the world could be redeemed. And this delivery of the Messiah, in turn, was good news given to the world to be able to redeem itself, return to the Creator, and therefore be renewed. But all of this only through Yeshua the Messiah, who is the only way to reach and return to the Father. There is no other way. There is no religion. There is no pastor. There is no priest. There is no medium. There's nothing. Only the Messiah, only Yeshua. And in this chapter, we can see that this is how it concludes with the good news of Yeshua, with the service of Yeshua, the liberator of souls who were in spiritual and physical slavery. Because if we really think about it, when we live based on our carnality, when we live based on emotions, based on blindness, spiritual blindness, and physical blindness, we come throughout our whole life, we come dragging burdens that prevent us from moving forward, from growing, not only as human beings with our emotions and maturity, but also in our spiritual life. We are detained by those burdens that we are dragging when we live in disobedience, when we live in sin. So when we are freed from all of that slavery, physical and spiritual, when we are freed by the Messiah from that slavery, it is how by recognizing the Messiah and his service and returning to the Father, then we have that opportunity. We have that opportunity to be redeemed by the Messiah, and therefore we are free to serve the Father and to live, or we are free. We have that freedom, or we receive that freedom so that we can live to serve the Father, just as we can see it was the case of the Messiah. Yes, although he did not sin, he lived a perfect life. He was perfect because he was just perfect. But we can take his example of living, or of what it is to live for the service of the Father. Or, for example, we can also take as an example the life of the apostles, disciples, patriarchs, or even prophets, who at some point in their life we can read that they did sin, that they in this case the apostles and the disciples, before their calling they lived in sin. Before their calling they were blinded by religions, they were blinded by emotions, they were blinded by by immaturity, etc. Yet the moment that they did the Shuvah, the moment that they returned to the Father, the moment that they reflected on their actions and they understood their calling, they fulfilled with their calling, that is where they started, or they understood, and they started to live their lives for the service, to live their life to serve the Father, to fulfill with their calling, to please the Father, and to fulfill His will. And that same example, that same attitude, that same action, the lifestyle that the apostles, disciples, patriarchs, prophets, the Messiah, and even other biblical characters that we can read within the scriptures, they become a good example of what it is to live for the service of the Father, and that it's something that we must apply to our lives as believers, or as people, or as souls that we call ourselves be disciples of the Messiah. And all of this reminds us about the confidence and the trust that we must put in the Father in all times, no matter if it's easy times or if it's hard times. And the importance of also persevering in service to the Father and in that obedience. And to conclude with today's study, I would like for us to read 1 Peter 2 verse 21 to reflect on it and to take these words of Peter and to apply them to our lives. It says, "To this you were called, because Mashiach suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." And well, this is all for today's video. Thank you very much for your time, and we will see each other in the next one.